Did you have anything to do with the death of JonBenet?
My name is JonBenet Ramsey.
What is your favorite animal at the zoo?
The monkeys because they laugh and stuff and hang around. I want to be a doctor or a nurse to help people get well.
What kind of doctor do you want to be?
A pediatrician. I want to be a cowboy sweetheart. I want to learn to rope and to ride. 911 emergency.
Police.
What's going on?
5515th Street.
What's going on there, ma'am?
We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please.
Explain to me what's going on, okay?
There's a note left and our daughter's gone.
A note was left and your daughter is gone? How old is your daughter?
6 years old. She's blind. 6 years old.
How long ago was this?
I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's
Does it say who took her?
What?
Does it say who took her?
I don't know. There's a ransom note here.
It's a ransom note?
It says SBTC. Victory.
This week, I'll be giving the official timeline of the most crucial events that transpired the day JonBenet Ramsey went missing. Then I'll discuss what I personally found to be the most disturbing facts in this case. In a couple of weeks, I'll follow that up with part 2, which includes a detailed explanation of what I believe happened and what I think is the smoking gun that points directly to her killer. It's December 25th, 1996, Christmas Day. The Ramseys, a family of 4 located in Boulder, Colorado, have returned from a Christmas party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends of theirs. On the way home, they stopped by the homes of 2 additional families to deliver gifts, the last being the home of the Steins. The Ramsey parents, John and Patsy, and their eldest child, a 9-year-old boy named Burke, all claimed at some point that 6-year-old JonBenet was asleep in the car on the way home, sometime between 9 and 10 p.m. I've heard people say they arrived home at 9:30, and I've heard some people say around 10. Regardless, it took place between 9 and 10 p.m. They arrived home. JonBenet was later carried up the stairs to bed by her father, John Ramsey, where he laid her across the bed. John would later report that he left her dressed, following which her mother, Patsy Ramsey, later entered to dress her for bed. In a documentary that aired in 1998 called JonBenet's America, John Ramsey would report that for a while he couldn't get Burke to go to bed because he was fussing around with a model train set, and that he had helped him put it together before they both went to bed.
Burke was downstairs trying to put together a model of some kind he'd gotten for Christmas, and I couldn't get him to go to bed because we were going to get up early the next morning, and leave to go to Michigan, and so I helped him put it together so I could get him to go on to bed, and so then he went to bed, and Patch and I went to bed.
John would later tell investigators he recalled going to bed around 10:30 p.m. and that by the time he went to bed, Patsy was already in bed. John would then recount for investigators that the following morning, around 5:30 a.m., he awakened before Patsy, I believe, and they went into separate bathrooms to get ready for the day. They were planning to take a private flight to Charlevoix, Michigan, to their summer home and spend time with John's adult children from a previous marriage. Later, Patsy Ramsey would have a few inconsistencies in how she recounted the next part, but for brevity's sake, she generally said she walked down the spiral staircase in the rear of the home, only to find a 3-page letter lining one of the steps. Once she read the beginning of the letter, it became clear to her it was a ransom letter stating that JonBenet had been taken. Patsy then reportedly bolted to JonBenet's room, only to find that she was indeed missing. It was then said that she alerted her husband, who moved the ransom letter from the staircase to the floor, and then Patsy eventually called 911 around 5:52 a.m. During this ruckus, it is reported by all parties in the home, meaning John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey, that Burke remained asleep in bed and slept through it all essentially, which is highly unusual. John apparently went to check on him, but did not wake him, and left him in his room alone, despite the inherent threat to the family after an intruder had theoretically entered and taken their daughter. Sometime just before 6 a.m., the first officer, Rick French, arrived on the scene, and he does a perimeter search, which is just standard practice, in which he notices there were no footprints in the light dusting of snow covering the grounds, and then he searches the home, not finding the little girl. It is said that he approaches a white cellar door in the basement, but because it was latched, he did not bother to look inside because he was searching for exits possibly used by the perpetrator. So a door that was latched from the outside, so it would not be possible for someone escaping through that door to have latched it behind themselves. So he ruled that out as the potential exit. Shortly after calling 911, Patsy would proceed to call over countless friends and acquaintances, which would eventually amount to Fleet and Priscilla White, whose Christmas party they had attended the night before, John and Barbara Fernie, as well as Reverend Roland Haverstock, pastor of the St. John's Episcopal Church, and eventually JonBenet's pediatrician would even arrive. The police would also send over 2 victim advocates. As the morning wore on, countless police officers, detectives, FBI agents, and forensic specialists arrived at the home, all under the impression that they were dealing with a kidnapping, and going off the word of the parents and the previous officers who had searched the home, that the little girl had been taken. No one thought she was in the home, meaning no one was thinking to preserve the home as a crime scene per se, because the crime of kidnapping was underway and they were waiting on a call from the kidnappers to arrange the ransom drop-off. Even though at this phase, which detectives called the kidnapping phase, they still should have exercised some due diligence to preserve evidence, because still theoretically perpetrators had come into the home and there could be evidence discovered, even if she was taken out of the home. So one of the detectives that was waiting on the ransom call was Detective Linda Arndt, who reportedly arrived on the scene around 8 a.m. Linda Arndt would later infamously be scapegoated by the department and by the Ramseys for why things fell apart in that crime scene, although a huge factor that played a role in the crime scene being botched beyond repair was the Ramseys' deliberate efforts to mislead everyone about what was going on, in my opinion. And the police investigation was compromised by Patsy calling over countless friends and acquaintances before the police even arrived to tell her that she couldn't. And these friends and acquaintances would later traipse freely through the home, moving things and searching things and contaminating potential evidence. At one point, I believe one of the female friends even began cleaning and wiping things down at the same time they were dusting for fingerprints, which is insane. And John also single-handedly obliterated the crime scene once JonBenet was finally found. So blaming Linda Arndt for why things went wrong is just a little misogynistic in my opinion. It was noted by several officers that 10 a.m., the presumed time the kidnapper had agreed to call that morning, everything had come and gone without incident, and that strangely, the parents never took notice, let alone said anything about it. That's when things started to become stranger and stranger, and the ransom note was heavily scrutinized, as well as the 2 writing pads that were handed over to investigators by John for handwriting samples of the parents. Several troubling aspects would eventually arise from these writing pads, mostly the one that was attributed to Patsy. Firstly, the paper seemed to match the paper used in the ransom note, but also the handwriting in the ransom note appeared eerily similar to Patsy's other writings in that same tablet, and ultimately, other pages were discovered in her writing tablet with partial text that appear to have been practice ransom notes, all written on the same pad, all in the same ink, later linked to a felt pen discovered near the phone, and also it would appear the kidnapper had taken the time to write the unusually lengthy ransom note in the home. That certainly raised the investigators' suspicions about the residents of the home as they continued to try to figure out who had taken the Ramseys' youngest child. At some point during the chaos, Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's 9-year-old brother, was reportedly swept away from the home to go and stay at the Whites' home, even though Priscilla and Fleet White were still at the Ramsey home. So it's not very clear who Burke went to be with at that home. In time, most investigators and officers would leave the Ramsey home after the ransom note time came and went with no activity from the suspected kidnappers. Detective Linda Arndt was left alone at the Ramsey home with the Ramseys, the Whites, the Fernies, the pastor, as the lone officer left in control of the crime scene and about 9 other adults. It became difficult for her to keep track of everyone and keep the crime scene contained at the same time. Mind you, she still had no clue what the nature of this crime was. In her mind, the little girl had been taken and was out of the home. She reportedly lost sight of John Ramsey for a prolonged period of time and later found his behavior when he resurfaced to be suspicious. He was visibly agitated, quiet, and tended to venture off alone, isolated from the others. Unlike Patsy, who was surrounded by support at all times and behaving in a theatrically grievous manner. Around 1 p.m., Linda Arndt, seeking to keep John's mind occupied, because remember, she still believes he is the father of a kidnapped child, not anything more sordid. But she wanted to keep his mind occupied, and so she suggested that he and Fleet White search the home from top to bottom and look for anything out of place or look for anything of JonBenet's that may have been missing, which may have given them clues as to who took her. John grabbed Fleet White and beelined it straight for the basement, which many people found suspicious. And in a later interview, John would say that the basement was the most logical place a kidnapper would have entered from, or exited from, I suppose. And my only question is, why would he think that? That's completely bizarre, and not in any way the most logical place for an intruder to have entered or exited. Windows and doors on the ground floor are far more likely. I personally believe it's obvious why John headed to the basement first, and in my opinion, it's because he knew far more about what he was gonna discover than he would ever let on. In my opinion, it's very clear he knew where she was for an extended period of time. Once John and Fleet entered the basement, Fleet would later report that John went straight to the obscure latched cellar door, and as soon as he opened it, he cried out that he'd essentially found her. Fleet would later report that he had searched the home on his own earlier because he had a feeling she might have been in the home someplace based on a scare he'd had himself where his young daughter had gone missing and the family panicked, but she was later found in the home hiding. He thought that may have been the case with JonBenet, so he figured he would search the house anyway, although people were saying she had been taken. And Fleet would admit to entering that same door John had entered and discovered JonBenet, but said at the time when he entered, the windowless room was so impenetrably dark he could see nothing, not even the light switch to illuminate the room. So how could John have possibly seen her as soon as he opened that door? Anyway, after John found JonBenet, Fleet ran up the stairs yelling for someone to call 911. According to Detective Linda Arndt, John would come flying up the stairs carrying JonBenet above his head, and she noted that the little girl's face was cocked to the side, that her lips were blue, and that she had rope hanging from her wrists, and eerily, she said her arms were suspended above her head and that her corpse was in full rigor mortis, meaning a phase of decomposition. John would proceed to lay the body on the floor in one room, then Linda Arndt checked her pulse before moving her into another room, where John eventually laid across and beside the body at one point, crying or appearing to cry, but I remember Linda Arndt saying she didn't see any tears, and then John eventually tossed a blanket over JonBenet's body before Patsy came and laid across the body as well, sobbing dramatically. It's also reported that Patsy at one point cried out for God to resurrect JonBenet just like he had resurrected Lazarus, which is amazing. At that point, additional officers and agents and crime scene investigators descended upon the home and finally closed off the crime scene, long after it had been contaminated to a detrimental degree. During the chaos of those final moments before the police would lose their grasp on the Ramseys, who did all they could to evade formal questioning for months, one of the officers on the scene overheard John Ramsey on the phone changing his previous flight plans from Charlevoix, Michigan, where the family had intended to travel that morning, to Atlanta, Georgia, which was a bit strange. Many later asked why on earth a father who'd just discovered his precious little daughter had been brutally murdered in their home would be trying to book a flight to Atlanta, Georgia, instead of staying to see that her remains were properly taken care of by law enforcement, and then trying to voluntarily help law enforcement in any way he could to solve this horrifying crime. It was noted by one of the investigators that most parents had great difficulty releasing the remains of a deceased child to law enforcement. The fact that John was prepared to leave the state the same day her body was found, mere hours later, certainly raised eyebrows. What further raised eyebrows was the fact that before the day was done, John Ramsey would assemble a legal defense team that included separate attorneys for both he and his wife, which detectives found odd, almost like there was a divide in the marriage after that day. But he also reportedly hired attorneys for his extended family and even his ex-wife, so that when police sought to question any of these people, there were attorneys present to obstruct and restrict the process in any way they could, which is highly suspicious. John's extensive legal team would also include a publicist and multiple private investigators, which, without question, is far more indicative of the behavior of a guilty man than an innocent one. In time, this case would take a merciless toll on the town of Boulder, Colorado, its citizens who for a time lived in fear of a child murderer at large, and they lived in turmoil due to the increased media presence. And this case would take a toll on the police department, who worked tirelessly around the clock to solve this case, many driven to madness and emotional distress because they were unsuccessful and felt responsible for the department's failures, and whose resources were worn thin as they were forced to chase their tails and chase countless dead-end leads for years, obstructed in every regard by a cowardly DA's office who were overly sympathetic to the prime suspects in this case. As Steve Thomas, a former detective on the case who would resign in anger due to the DA's incompetence and willful obstruction of justice, would say, this case would wreck marriages and careers. And it's worth noting that Steve Thomas was surrounded by deceit, incompetence, obstruction, and cowardice everywhere he turned, and it is perfectly understandable why he gave up in the end. He did a commendable job in his book of holding everyone's feet to the fire and illustrating where they all fell short in their roles, especially the Ramseys and the cowardly Boulder District Attorney's Office. What it boiled down to was the DA, Alex Hunter, and his deputy, Peter Hofstrom, refused to prosecute some of the coldest, most callous killers to the fullest extent of the law, meaning capital punishment, even when they had the suspects in custody and all the evidence at their disposal. They refused to give them the death penalty and struck outrageous plea deals left and right. Some estimated that the DA's office in Boulder, Colorado at the time was plea bargaining over 90% of their cases, including murderers and rapists, which is incomprehensible. So it was beyond clear they had zero appetite for bringing the full force of the law down upon violent offenders. Therefore, without a stereotypical bad guy to pin JonBenet's murder on, they arguably wanted this particular case to be swept under the rug and to go unsolved so they could maintain their ludicrous plea bargaining record. They had zero interest in holding JonBenet's parents accountable in any way because of the optics and politics of the time. This is the reason this child never got justice. On top of her parents' relentless PR narratives spun on mainstream news stations since days following her funeral. The case of JonBenet Ramsey would go on to become notorious for incompetent police work, a horrendously botched crime scene in which the body was moved multiple times, a gutless DA office, and evasive parents who would much rather sit for primetime interviews to repair their reputation than with the police officers desperately trying to find their daughter's killer. And by virtue of their determination to obstruct the investigation in any way they could and divert suspicion from themselves through their attorneys and PIs and connects at the DA's office, they ensured their precious daughter became an afterthought in this investigation and no longer the central motivation propelling it. To them, it's clear their pride, reputations, and helping everyone who survived in that house that night avoid accountability was far more important than bringing her killer to justice. At 5:52 a.m. on December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey would phone 911 to inform them her daughter had been kidnapped. Aside from Patsy's theatrics and her odd choice of words during the 911 call, such as, "We have a kidnapping," there was a lot more about her frantic 5 a.m. 911 call that would raise eyebrows over the years. Firstly, why on earth did Patsy hang up the phone while the 911 operator was still speaking to her, trying to get her to divulge critical details about her daughter's disappearance? In my opinion, it's because she was putting on a performance that would only be believable for so long, and so she wanted the call to end so that she could feel relief. If it was a real kidnapping, in my opinion, I do not believe anyone would have just hung up on the 911 operator the way she did, especially not when the woman was actively still trying to engage with her. A mother of a real missing child would have been providing as much info as she possibly could. There would have been a sense of urgency around finding her daughter, and she would be willing to provide that information so that police officers on the ground could have been on the lookout for their child or her kidnappers. But none of that occurred to Patsy logically because she knew JonBenet wasn't missing, so she hung up on the woman after her performance was complete. That is, she thought she hung up. In reality, the call was still recording, and the 911 operator would later report she heard a distinct shift in Patsy's tone and demeanor after she thought she'd hung up the phone. And enhanced audio from the 911 call eventually proved Patsy had been speaking to at least 2 other people at the end of that call. Experts suspect that those 2 people were John Ramsey and Burke Ramsey, the 9-year-old son the parents continuously insisted was asleep during that call, and in fact throughout the entire morning, right? It is believed by the experts who listened to that enhanced audio that Patsy may have said at the end of the call, "What did you do? Help me, Jesus." And they also believe John Ramsey could be heard saying, "We are not talking to you." And lastly, it is believed that they heard Burke Ramsey saying, "What did you find?" Obviously, this is something that can never be known definitively either way, but the enhanced audio indeed seems to align with what experts believe was being said on the tape by the specific individuals in question. And what is being theoretically said in that enhanced audio also happens to perfectly align with different aspects of my theory about this case, which I'll be discussing in video number 2 of this mini-series. I had often heard of the case of JonBenet Ramsey, and I knew her face pretty well, but I had never looked into the details of this case before. So when I did, My God, was I utterly shocked by the brutality of her death and the fact that the evidence seemed to suggest she had been tormented by a sadistic monster before her unaliving. The autopsy revealed she had suffered severe blunt force trauma to her skull, which horrified me, especially if you are so unfortunate as to see the autopsy photos and see that massive fracture that ran the entire length of her tiny little skull and the chunk of skull that had been caved in because she was struck with just that much force. It was all quite nauseating to learn. So is the fact that she had likely been bound by the wrists and that there was a ligature wrapped so tightly around her throat it wasn't even visible from the front because it had been embedded so deeply into her flesh. She was strangled just that hard, and due to the markings around her neck, experts have determined she was still alive to some degree, even if she may have been brain dead when she was being strangled. And due to the hemorrhaging in her brain, it is also believed that she was still alive when she was struck on the head. So she likely might have been strangled after she was struck on the head and was lying brain dead. So again, it appeared to me that her killer was especially violent with her because they inflicted the greatest amount of pain and terror on this small child her body could have possibly sustained. Not only that, but there was also reportedly evidence that she had been sodomized with an object that matched the broken wooden paintbrush used in the murder weapon because they found wooden splinters that matched the paintbrush handle inside of her privates, along with her own blood. Her privates also reportedly showed indications of past trauma and inflammation that could have been caused by chronic sexual abuse, but it did not indicate that this trauma was the result of penile penetration. It was reported that her privates showed signs of digital manipulation, and some experts ruled out that it could have been the result of self-exploration. I just have no words. No words for how revolting and distressing all the information gleaned from her medical examination was. According to Linda Hoffman Pugh, the Ramseys' housekeeper, and later Patsy's mother and Patsy herself, JonBenet was a chronic bedwetter. According to the housekeeper, however, JonBenet had wet the bed consistently for a period of time to the point where Patsy put her in pull-up diapers, and the investigators corroborated this when they discovered a bag of these diapers stored someplace near JonBenet's room. But then the housekeeper said the little girl stopped wetting the bed for a period of time. Eventually, she started wetting the bed again within the last month before her death. This is critically important because these events could be inextricably connected. Her bedwetting could have been induced by stress or trauma that she was experiencing in the home, or her renewed bladder problems could have even served as the catalyst to her death that night, particularly when it comes to invoking the wrath of one of her caregivers, who may have reacted explosively and in a manner that led to her death. Detective Steve Thomas mentioned in his book, often the fouling of a bed is seen in cases of incest, as a child tries to appear undesirable to an offender. Personally, I think it's important to note bedwetting can be a symptom of stress or trauma in children, although JonBenet was still within the age range where it was considered normal. She was at the very end of that range, but still. And in my opinion, the bedwetting is still something to take note of because her being in the age range where it was somewhat normal does not wholly discredit the idea that it could have also been caused by a trauma of some kind. Also, it's worth noting that bedwetting is more common in boys than in girls. Lastly, we should keep in mind bedwetting could also be caused by a medical condition, but I have not found any information that JonBenet suffered from any notable illnesses or conditions before her death. The morning of JonBenet's disappearance, if they really thought JonBenet was missing and had been kidnapped by a small foreign faction, why would they have been so comfortable leaving their son alone, asleep in that giant house, and on a separate floor from them, no less, where they couldn't hear anything that was going on with him? Especially when the ransom note specifically said they were under constant surveillance by this particular faction. They threw all caution to the wind and left him upstairs and even called the police, which is directly against against the instructions in the ransom note. So clearly they did not believe whatever the ransom note was saying. They didn't see it as a real threat, and there's a reason for that, in my opinion. They were unbothered by Burke being away from them because they knew in their subconscious that there was no threat, because the ransom note had likely been written by Patsy. Also, think about it for a second. If JonBenet was truly kidnapped, why would they not also kidnap Burke to double the ransom money when he was equally fair game, especially when the motive for the so-called kidnapping was financial in nature? There would be no reason for a professional foreign faction to spare Burke in this case, since again, the note did not specify that they took JonBenet for sexual perversions, or because there was anything in particular about her at all. It was all staged as being a play for money and to taunt John because they didn't respect the country he worked for, even though they somehow respected his business. And it's been noted by experts that it sounded like whoever wrote the ransom note was trying not to defame John's business, so their sales wouldn't be impacted, basically. Even within the universe of this hoaxy ransom note, this case is completely illogical, which would only be the result of a staging where the crime was not committed with a specific singular logic, but was done with a presumption in mind of the way criminals think and act, and therefore a distorted, inauthentic rationale was forced onto the crime retroactively as a red herring of sorts, which is why nothing about this case makes logical sense. But in doing so, the stagers actually only drew attention to the fact that the kidnapping was a ruse. And despite Burke being a critical witness who was present at the time of the kidnapping, John and Fleet White got him dressed and spirited away to the White's home, meaning away from the security of law enforcement and his own family, despite his sister having just been kidnapped by a terrorist cell who were supposedly watching their every move. And when Officer Rick French tried to speak to Burke before he left, John apparently intervened, saying he was asleep and knew nothing of what had occurred. That is highly suspicious, meaning Burke was likely not questioned until long after he was coached on what to say. Any other parent in the situation would have likely been frightened enough to leave the house and would have kept their child in their sight the entire time. But the Ramseys did not behave like normal parents in this situation in any regard, especially when you consider the fact that they barely interacted with one another when the police were there. And despite Patsy being an emotional wreck and John being a cool, reserved cucumber, he never sought to do anything to console his wife, which is very odd. These were the incidents listed in Steve Thomas's book. In the summer of 1994, JonBenet was accidentally hit on the left cheek by a golf club swung by her brother Burke, and her mother rushed the child to see a plastic surgeon who thought Patsy was overreacting. Two things are very apparent in that sentence. Burke was aggressive and violent with JonBenet on occasions that predated her death. The second obvious thing is that Patsy seemed more concerned with JonBenet's physical appearance than her physical well-being. Why would you rush the child to a plastic surgeon and not the hospital to make sure nothing in her face was fractured? It seems like she was more worried about the cosmetic aspects of JonBenet's appearance, and probably whether or not she can continue in the pageants, which is insane, and shows what Patsy's priorities were where her daughter was concerned. In 1995, JonBenet tripped in a grocery store and landed on her nose, and the doctor treated her with ice and popsicles. 6 months later, she fell again, boinking herself over the left eye. In the 24 months before her death, she visited the doctor 18 times, which seems excessive to some people. And also, it's worth noting, a lot of people who are being abused and their caretakers tend to say that they fell or that they injured themselves when they turn out to be injured. They usually victim blame to divert attention away from whoever is doing the abusing. So that's worth noting about the instances where she so-called fell. She went to see the school nurse twice in December, both times on a Monday after a weekend. So after she had been at home with her family, she went to see the school nurse on that following Monday, which is odd. In mid-September, a panel of pediatric experts from around the country reached one of the major conclusions of the investigation, that JonBenet has suffered vaginal trauma prior to the day she was killed. There were no dissenting opinions among them on this issue, and they firmly rejected any possibility that the trauma to the hymen and the chronic vaginal inflammation were caused by urination issues or masturbation. We gathered affidavits stating in clear language that there were injuries consistent with prior trauma and sexual abuse. There was chronic abuse, past violation of the vagina, evidence of both acute injury and chronic sexual abuse. In other words, the doctors were saying it had happened before. One expert summed it up well when he said the injuries were not consistent with sexual assault, but with a child who was being physically abused. The question is, if she was being physically abused in that house, which her medical examination after her death and her excessive doctor visits before her death seemed to indicate, who was her abuser and who was the enabler of her abuse? Abuse certainly cannot be ruled out, since we know this little girl was the victim of the ultimate form of abuse in her home, which was murder. I do believe that in many ways, JonBenet may have been being physically and emotionally abused leading up to her death, and neglected in a lot of ways, and exploited. I believe the things Steve Thomas listed in his book, while on the surface may read as innocuous, such as her falling, when taken in consideration with the brutality of her ultimate fate and her parents' refusal to cooperate with the police during the investigation, which means they may have been adverse to cooperating with any sort of police or law enforcement previously if she brought up issues of abuse. It's not difficult for me to believe she was suffering all along in many ways, and that her parents were either the cause of it or were involved in covering it up all along, just as I believe they did after her death. I honestly have a quite vivid idea of what was taking place that seems to make sense of her theoretical abuse that I'll share during my theory in part 2 of these videos. Patsy, as we know, was a dreaded pageant mom, which means she shares the world's contempt for the exploitation of children and living vicariously through one's own children right alongside dance moms, stage moms, and sports dads. She was rather determined to involve JonBenet in the pageant circuit at an age I thought was extremely too young. JonBenet's time in pageantry can be traced back as early as 3 to 4 years old, which is disturbing to me. A 4-year-old has only been alive, meaning on the earth, for 4 years. I could not imagine wanting to take someone that young and guzzy them up and even bleach their hair to be ogled on stage by a crowd of strangers. I could not imagine how that sort of attention would impact the emotional and mental well-being of a child that young and who is still learning to navigate their personhood. This is just as bad as child stardom in movies and TV shows or in the music industry, which often leads to destroying the child's life and perspective and self-esteem down the road. And this is all aside from the highly problematic aspects of child pageantry in particular, such as putting a 4-year-old in very adult-looking makeup and skimpy outfits and making them prance around like a show pony. It's inarguably objectifying. And when you factor in that a 4-year-old is in no position to meaningfully give consent to do basically anything, especially not anything that involves objectifying her body in front of strangers to this degree, in my opinion, it is tantamount to child abuse and exploitation. With that being said, JonBenet's pageantry at such an extremely early age sort of tells us all we need to know about what type of parents the Ramseys were, and therefore her death no longer seems surprising. There was some sort of extreme dysfunction going on in that large, disturbing home, at least for me, and many people suspect that this dysfunction went well beyond the forced pageantry and exploitation of their youngest child. And you notice that a lot of their excuses for why JonBenet was in pageantry was to blame her for wanting it, which is something that a lot of pedos do. They say she's mature for her age, or that she was interested, she came onto them, she wanted it. So these are the excuses given for why JonBenet was being objectified at such a young age. She wanted it. She wanted her hair dyed. She wanted to wear adult makeup. She wanted to skimp around and do strip teases. So Conclusively, at least for me, John and Patsy Ramsey have zero credibility where their accounts of their daughter's death is concerned. They were two very disturbing people, to put it mildly. And the other member of the household, Burke Ramsey, was even more disturbing. And I read it on him from the second I saw a muted video of his interrogation. I didn't even have to hear his voice. Even his body language and mannerisms were disturbing. And his dreadful little smile, which we all know so well, that people like to excuse him for because he's socially awkward. Sure. And it's important to note, he has never stopped being disturbing, even decades later as an adult in Dr. Phil's interview.